Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. This lesson is part of an extended discussion on identifying potential root causes for eventually building a data collection plan, or DCP. In this lesson, I'll build on the previous lessons by discussing how to narrow down the potential root causes that were identified in the C&E diagram and 5 whys concept by using a cause and effect matrix, or C&E Matrix. The C&E Matrix is that next step which can be essential when trying to build the DCP. So it's essential that you at least review the previous lessons that first introduced you to the DCP, the C&E diagram, and the 5 whys concept. But for now, let's quickly review again how the C&E Matrix can fit into this discussion on identifying root causes.
Remember, what we're trying to do here is to build the transfer function. That's the y equals f of x. In order to do that, we have to begin with trying to build the data collection plan, or the DCP. So we should already know what the project y is. So now we need to find out what are those potential x's for that transfer function. And it's the data collection plan that's going to help us ensure that we have enough data for measuring that y and every one of those x's within the transfer function. So what we're going to review again is the overall method for how we might build the DCP. And started off with, as an input to our meeting with the team, it's going to begin with making sure we have the defined phase items, which would also include the y and the defect definitions. All those things that we should have up to this point, make sure we have those already defined before the meeting even begins. And then for the meeting itself, the process that will actually follow during the meeting is going to begin with this next step, which is validating the y and the defect definition with the team to make sure they agree with it. And next we want to identify what are all the potential x's that the team believes are the x's that could be part of that transfer function. Well, we might use several tools again, like the cause and effect diagram, which is also the fishbone and Ishikawa diagram, and also the 5 whys tool. Once we've identified the potential x's, then we move on to the next step, which was narrowing down those potential x's to what we consider to be the most critical x's. This is where we might use the cause and effect matrix, or the C&E matrix, to figure that out. Then the last part here is an output from the meeting. What we're going to do is our last step is to build the data collection plan, that DCP, for those critical x's we identified. And this is where we're going to use something like the sample size calculator, as well as consideration for the short and long-term data and the data collection plan, in order to build this final data collection plan from this process.
Okay, now let's begin to define what the C&E Matrix is.
Well, C&E Matrix is a tool that helps evaluate and prioritize all potential root causes that were identified in some of the original documents, like the C&E diagram and the 5 whys tool. It's really similar to a QFD tool, where it objectively evaluates the team's subjective opinion about the causes that have been identified. So what's the purpose of the C&E Matrix? Well, it's a way of narrowing down all potential causes to just the critical few that are most likely to be the root causes. It helps the team to focus on evaluating each cause individually and the direct impact that each one has on the effect. It also allows for an objective comparison for how each potential cause influences each effect. So as an example of what one might look like, here's an example of what it looks like in an Excel, where we have on the left-hand side all the different potential inputs that were identified, or those potential root causes or factors identified from the C&E diagram and 5 whys tool will be listed off here to the side. And then the effects that you might have will be listed across the top here, and you can have multiple effects. Sometimes you have the same potential root causes that influence these different potential effects. And the idea is you want to see how they align with each other. What's the level of impact each of those potential inputs or those potential root causes could have on the undesirable effects that you're seeing. And you rate that based off of whether it has a 0 level impact, that is no impact at all, 1 meaning like a low level impact, 3 meaning like a mid-level type of impact, or 9 meaning a high level impact. And it factors for you what the calculation is as far as the root causes, those potential root causes that seem to have the highest factored value based off of the number of and method of how it affects those different undesirable effects. And then you might further identify on here the side the potential method for collecting data around those most critical undesirable effects.
Now let's talk about how you can build a C&E Matrix.
As I mentioned before, the C&E Matrix is a collaborative tool, just like many of the other tools, that you work with your team, and it could be the natural next step if you have a C&E diagram or the 5 whys that you've combined together in the past. You can use this C&E Matrix as that next natural step for trying to work those down to see what are the most critical or the top priorities of potential root causes that you want to explore. So you would get your information from the C&E diagram, and then you can follow the steps kind of like in this order as a priority. First, you begin with identifying what are the effects or the defects that you had used within your C&E diagrams, and try to exclude any duplicate causes that you might have had. So across the top here, this is where you fill those different effects in. If you had only one, that's fine, just stick with the one. Or if you have multiple ones, you could do that as well. The template that's provided can have many different effects listed on there, but generally you're going to find just maybe 1 to 3 that are used. So you identify those in the top. And next what you want to do is assign an importance rating for each of those different effects. So you might say for this particular effect the importance is just a 1, it's a low level importance, versus maybe another one that might be 9, meaning it's a high level of importance. Or maybe you can, instead of importance, you might think of it in terms of the severity of the effect, how big a deal it is to you, or how severe that impact is on the overall symptoms that you're feeling for this project and why it's a big deal. You might think of it in those types of terms. But either way, you would need to identify that type of ranking for each one of these different effects. And it's okay if you happen to have duplicates here. They both, maybe 2 or more, have the same severity in the effect itself. And that's okay if it has that way. But if there is a difference, then you want to clearly define that difference within the different ratings here. Next thing you want to do is, in this section, you'd fill in what all those different potential root causes are that were identified within the cause and effect diagram itself. So every unique one, just make sure you fill it in here in this section. Now what's displayed here are just 5, but you might have a lot more, and that's perfectly okay. Make sure you get every one of those identified on here. And next what you want to do is, for each one of these different potential root causes related to each of these effects, you want to ask the team what level of impact or level of influence that each of those potential root causes has on that undesirable effect. So you would take one of these potential root causes at a time, and you would ask, all right, well, what type of influence does that have on this effect, or how much of an influence do we think it has? Is it a high level influence, which is like a 9, medium level, which is a 3 that we type in, or low, meaning a 1 that we type in there, or maybe no influence at all? Then we might plug in the 0 if that's the case. So you work through every one of these boxes. I recommend sticking with one potential root cause at a time, and then working across each of those effects to figure out what the team believes is the best rating for each one. Now if the team starts to struggle with an answer, if they're not sure what number to plug in there, or there's some debate over it, then another way you can ask it is, if we were to fix that root cause, the items that are identified here, if we were to fix that particular root cause that we're struggling over, how severe would the pain of that effect still be? Well, if they feel like, well, actually, if we fix that root cause, then we probably think that a whole effect would go away. Well, if that's true, then it probably has a high impact. If we think the pain would still be there and it wouldn't make that much of a difference, the chances are it's a low impact or maybe no influence at all. So maybe just wording it a little bit differently could help your team work through what they think the best answers are for inputting in here. And this is where you're going to spend the majority of your time plugging in the numbers for what the team believes are the level of influences or impact each of those potential root causes has on each effect. And by doing that, it's going to calculate for you automatically a number in this total column. And what it's going to do is, based off of the rating that you gave each effect, and based off of the level of influence each of those root causes had on each effect, it's going to come up with a score, a multiplier here, and it's going to tally up here. And that score is basically the total that will reflect which one of those potential root causes are probably the ones that are most critical. So whatever is the highest number, whatever has the highest total over in this total column, is the one that's going to be most critical. Now, it may not be so obvious as far as the distinction between some potential root causes. Sometimes it can be obvious if you have some that have very high numbers and other ones that are very low. The point is, you try to identify what you think are the ones that are the top. And it doesn't mean you have to limit it by any degree, but if they all seem to be very high and equal, then maybe that means you need to collect data on all of them. But chances are it's not going to be exactly equal like that. There's going to be some variation between them. So again, you would just want to identify what are the top ones. So those are the items that you probably want to try to measure. So then what you would do in the space off to the right here is try to plan out where you might get the data. So you might have a general description of how you think you might measure that particular root cause. And if there's something that's a low value or low total, you don't have to fill in anything, or you can just make a note on there as well that this is probably something we don't need to collect data on. So by going through this entire exercise, the bottom line is you want to walk away with the critical few potential root causes. So that way you're targeting your data collection with the ones that are the most critical or most likely to be the root causes that you want to be able to analyze later on in the analyze phase.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
What I'd like you to do is go back to the prerequisite lesson that applies to this lesson, and that was the lesson where we talked about combining the C&E diagram and the 5 whys concept. In there we had a practical application, and in that practical application I want to use that to build off of in building C&E Matrix for this particular practical application in this lesson. So in that prior one, you should have identified some potential root causes. The example for the undesirable effects from that prior example were if you had some high fuel expense and you're trying to figure out why the fuel expense was so high, or maybe it's grocery expense or entertainment expense or something like that. Whatever you might have used in that prior practical application, use that as a baseline for this exercise. And then open up the spreadsheet template that's associated with the C&E Matrix and start to fill in the various components. For example, typing in the name of the effect that you identified in that prior example, and then assign an importance rating for each different effect if you had more than one. If you only had one, then you might be able to skip that step. Also then, type into the area that's designated each of those different causes that you identified in that prior lesson. And then type in the level of impact or influence each of those root causes had for each of those effects based off of the ranking that we had discussed in this lesson. And then select the top causes that have the highest result in the total column. So look at those results in the total column and figure out which ones are the top, which are the top few that really stand out among all the other potential root causes. And then you can use that as your basis for narrowing down your list to find out which ones are the most likely candidates or the most critical ones that lead to your undesirable effect. Now ask yourself some of these questions. Do these top causes, do those seem to be logical that they would be at the top? If not, then there may have been some subjective bias in the results, so you might need to explore that a little bit further. But if you only had one effect for this exercise, then the formal C&E matrix may not seem necessary at all. So the greatest value that you might have in using the C&E matrix is evident when you're trying to evaluate multiple effects across multiple causes. Now if you wanted to test that, you can just run through the same exercise again by adding more effects and more causes and watch the impact that it has by using that C&E matrix.
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.